In my family, the perfect Christmas is a carefully constructed lie. My name is Diane Patterson, and I've always been the good daughter, the one who doesn't make waves. But this holiday, under the glittering lights and the smell of pine, I've found the truth. They aren't just favoring my brother, they're actively betraying me to protect a secret that could ruin us all. My own family wants to destroy my career. Now I have to make a choice: stay silent and loyal, or burn it all down to save myself. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air in our house on Thanksgiving is always thick. It's a physical weight pressed down with the scent of my mother's 20-pound turkey, the sweet, sharp tang of cranberry sauce, and the decades of unspoken things that linger in the corners of every room. I'm Diane Patterson. I'm 29, and for as long as I can remember, this day has been less a celebration of thanks and more a performance. We live in a small Midwestern town where everyone knows your name, your business, and what car you drive. My parents, Helen and Robert Patterson, are the unofficial royalty of this town. Their holiday gatherings are the stuff of local legend, and their reputations are as carefully polished as the antique silverware Mom insists we use. I work at the local community center, a job I love, a job that feels real in a life that often feels staged. This Thanksgiving was no different. The fireplace crackled, the crystal glasses sparkled, and the house was full of neighbors and extended family, all laughing too loudly. I moved through the rooms, refilling glasses and smiling until my cheeks ached, feeling that familiar mix of warmth and unease. The warmth came from the genuine affection I have for some of these people, for the traditions themselves. The unease came from the Patterson family script. I saw my mother, elegant in a cashmere sweater set, guiding a conversation between my father and the mayor, her hand on the mayor's arm, her laugh light and strategic. My father, Robert, a man who could command a boardroom with a raised eyebrow, was holding court by the bourbon bar, projecting an aura of effortless success. They are and always have been pillars of the community. And then there was Nathan, my younger brother, the golden boy. He breezed in an hour late, all charm and apologies, and within 5 minutes he had my mother laughing and my father clapping him on the back. I watched, nursing a glass of cider, as Dad raised his glass for an impromptu toast before dinner was even served. "And a special congratulations to Nathan," Dad announced, his voice booming. "He's just landed the preliminary talks for the downtown revitalization project. Big things, son, big things." The room erupted in applause. Nathan, charming as ever, just shrugged and smiled. "Just trying to keep up with the old man," he said, and the room laughed again. I felt the familiar dull ache in my chest. I had just secured a $50,000 grant for the community center's after-school program, a grant I'd spent 6 months writing, revising, and fighting for. When I told my parents last week, my mother had said, "Oh, that's nice, dear," before immediately asking if I'd remembered to pick up the dry cleaning. At the dinner table, the subtle favoritism was a tangible thing, like an extra unwanted side dish. "Nathan, you have to tell us about that idea you had for the historical society," Mom urged, cutting him the largest slice of white meat. "It's just brilliant." I mentioned a new youth leadership program I was launching at the center. That's good, Diane," Dad said, his eyes already drifting back to Nathan. "But you have to be careful not to spread yourself too thin. Leadership is a heavy load." The unspoken part, the part I'd heard my whole life, hung in the air. "A load may be too heavy for you. Not for Nathan, of course, but for you." I saw it then so clearly it made me dizzy, the quiet, constant manipulation. The way they steered every family decision, every public conversation, to bolster Nathan's image and subtly diminish mine. I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being actively managed. I felt isolated, a single dissonant note in a perfectly harmonized choir. The warmth I'd felt earlier had curdled into a cold knot of resentment. I loved my family, I truly did. But I was tired of feeling unseen, of having to fight for every scrap of recognition, while Nathan was handed a feast. The holidays, with their forced cheer and intense focus on family, only magnified the feeling. I swallowed my frustration along with a bite of dry turkey and focused on getting through the night. Later, as the evening wound down and the smell of pumpkin pie filled the air, I went to find the good coffee beans in the pantry. The pantry is just off my father's study, and the door was cracked open just enough for me to hear their voices low, serious and stripped of the evening's practiced cheer. It was Mom and Dad. I froze my hand on the pantry doorknob. "I'm telling you, Robert, it's too much of a risk," Helen said, her voice sharp with a metallic edge I rarely heard. "If she gets that leadership role at the center, she'll have access to all the community board records. She'll see what we did." My blood turned to ice. The leadership role, I was the clear front-runner for the new director position. "It's handled," Dad's voice rumbled impatient. "I spoke to Henderson on the board. He understands the situation. We can't have Diane digging into those old files. It would ruin everything, not just for us, but for Nathan." Nathan. My stomach clenched. "What if she finds out on her own?" Mom pressed. "She's smart." "She won't," Dad said, his voice final. "This way, Nathan will be the one they see as the natural fit for community leadership. Her reputation won't recover if this gets out. We just need to make sure she stays contained." Contained. The word echoed in the sudden silence. I stood there, hidden in the shadow of the hallway, the bag of coffee beans slipping from my numb fingers. They weren't just favoring Nathan. They were actively working against me, discussing a secret that could destroy my career and my standing in this town, all to protect what? And to protect Nathan. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering a sick, frantic rhythm against my ribs, the scent of spice and coffee suddenly making me want to gag. After Thanksgiving, the holiday season descended on the town like a suffocating blanket of forced cheer. Twinkling lights were strung on every lamppost, and Joy to the World played on loop in the grocery store, but the words I'd overheard in the hallway had poisoned it all. Contained. The word looped in my head. I started seeing everything through this new ugly filter. It wasn't just my imagination. The slights, once subtle enough for me to dismiss as sensitivity, were now glaringly obvious. At the annual town square tree lighting ceremony, where I was supposed to be honored for the youth grant my father as a key community patron was invited to speak. He praised the community spirit of the center's board, barely mentioning my name, and then spent 5 minutes lauding Nathan's visionary new ideas for the revitalization project that didn't even have funding yet. I stood there holding a cup of rapidly cooling cocoa and felt my achievement shrink and dissolve in the cold night air. Later that week, at a planning meeting for the Christmas charity drive, my mother publicly dismissed a scheduling idea I proposed. "Oh, Diane, that's far too complicated," she said with a light laugh, turning to the mayor's wife. "You know how she gets so focused on the details. Let's stick to the simpler proven method." The proven method was Nathan's suggestion from last year, which had been a logistical mess. But they all nodded. I was the detail-oriented, complicated one. Nathan was the visionary. I felt the familiar burn of shame quickly followed by a cold, sharp anger. This was the script. My role was the competent but difficult daughter. His was the charming, effortless son. This went against everything I held myself to. I built my life on resilience and fairness. I'd worked hard to become independent, to build a career that mattered separate from the Patterson name. I believed in integrity. And here was my own family, the people who supposedly loved me, actively undermining the very independence they claimed to admire. The hypocrisy was a bitter pill. This inner turmoil was constant. I would be wrapping presents, the scent of pine and cinnamon in the air, and my stomach would twist with this cold knot of betrayal. The dissonance between the festive, loving facade of an American Christmas and the cold reality of my family's manipulation was making me feel crazy. I felt profoundly, utterly alone, trapped in a snow globe with a smiling family that was secretly sawing off the branch I was sitting on. I couldn't confront them. Not yet. Not without knowing what it was. What secret was so damaging it required them to sabotage my career. My father's words, "She'll see what we did," became my new obsession. I had to investigate, but I had to do it without them knowing. I became a ghost in my own life, smiling at holiday parties while my mind was miles away sifting through data. I started at the community center. I told my boss I was working on a year-end impact report, which gave me the perfect cover to be there at odd hours alone in the quiet, decorated building. I pulled the board meeting minutes from the past 3 years. I cross-referenced them with the town's public financial disclosures for the downtown revitalization project. I spent hours in the dusty basement file room, pulling old grant applications looking for the old files my father was so afraid of. I reviewed my own emails, my old performance reviews, searching for any instance where my father's advice had steered me away from an opportunity. I found it. A year ago, he'd mentored me, advising I remove a key project from my application for a regional leadership seminar, calling it too minor to include. That seminar, I now realized, was the main feeder for the state-level community board, the one my father sat on. The work was slow and heartbreaking. Every document was a potential new betrayal, but the real break came not from the past, but from the present. I was at the center late on a Tuesday, the only light coming from the small, glowing Christmas tree on my desk. I was trying to access the final submission list for the director position I'd been so sure I was the front-runner for. The posting had been abruptly paused 2 weeks ago right after Thanksgiving. The official reason was budget reevaluation. Now I knew better. I logged into the secure server using my administrative credentials, and I found it. It wasn't in the public folder. It was in a misfiled temporary directory, an email thread. The subject line was Patterson candidacy. My heart stopped. The first email was from my father to Mr. Henderson, the head of the community board, dated the day before the posting was paused. It was written in my father's signature smooth, authoritative tone. He was regretfully sharing deeply private family concerns about my ability to handle the significant stress of the director role, alluding to my overinvestment and emotional fragility. He suggested that for the good of the center, the board should look for someone with a more objective, business-minded approach. And then the killing blow, a forwarded attachment. It was an email from Nathan sent from his corporate account to our father. In it, Nathan detailed his concerns about my burnout, claiming my recent grant success was a team effort he had to step in and streamline. He was claiming credit for my work. And at the bottom of my father's email, the final horrifying suggestion: perhaps Nathan himself might be convinced to step in as an interim consultant. He has some fresh ideas that could truly revitalize the center. They hadn't just blocked me, they had conspired. My father used vague, insidious lies about my mental health, and my brother stole my work, all to install him in the very position they'd sabotaged me for. The room spun. I felt sick, the festive lights of the tree blurring into a nauseating kaleidoscope of color. I drove home from the community center that night in a daze, the printed-out email feeling like a physical weight in my bag. The town's Christmas lights, the ones I usually loved, seemed garish and mocking, their cheerful colors reflecting off the wet pavement in warped, bleeding streaks. I'd been contained. My own father had painted me as emotionally fragile, and my brother had stolen my work to build his own reputation. The word family echoed in my head, but it had a hollow, bitter sound. For 29 years, I'd been bound by the unspoken rules of Patterson loyalty, a code that demanded I smile through the slights and accept my role as the reliable, less shiny supporting act. But what is loyalty when it only flows one way? Is it loyalty to let them destroy my career, my reputation, the life I'd built for myself? No, that wasn't loyalty. That was sacrifice. And I was done being the lamb. The next morning, I called Margaret. She was my first boss at the center, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd retired 2 years ago but still mentored me. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the usual gossip mills. The smell of coffee and pastries felt normal, a painful contrast to the story I was about to tell. I slid the printed emails across the Formica table. I didn't cry. My voice was low and steady as I explained what I'd found, what I'd overheard at Thanksgiving. She read the pages, her expression hardening with every line. She didn't offer platitudes or tell me I must have misunderstood. When she finished, she pushed the papers back to me and folded her hands. "Well, Diane," she said, her voice a low growl, "this isn't just favoritism, and it's not just manipulation. This is deliberate, calculated sabotage." Hearing her validate it, seeing my own outrage reflected in her eyes, broke something loose in my chest. "What do I do, Margaret?" I whispered. "They're my family." "They drew the battle lines, not you," she said, her gaze unblinking. "Your integrity is all you have in this world, Diane. Don't you let them take that too. You need to protect yourself, and you need to be smart. Document everything. Every past slight you can remember, every conversation from now on. Create a paper trail they can't deny." Her words were a new spine. I left that cafe with a purpose. I bought a new password-protected thumb drive and a simple, lockable journal. I started the meticulous, heartbreaking work of building a case against my own family. I printed the emails from a public library computer, not the center. I saved copies of my original grant proposal, the one I'd written alone, and the final submitted version, highlighting the sections I knew Nathan would try to claim. I began to write in the journal every night, and the act of writing unleashed a flood of memories, small paper cuts of the past that I'd ignored. I remembered the 7th grade science fair. I'd spent a month building a working model of a water filtration system and won second place. Nathan, who'd built a baking soda volcano at the last minute, accidentally made it erupt all over the judge's table. He was so charming in his apology, so funny about the disaster, that they gave him a special, honorable mention for showmanship. On the car ride home, my parents hadn't mentioned my trophy once. It was all Nathan. "You really have a way with people," and "That's how you get noticed, son." I'd sat in the back, my second-place ribbon clutched in my hand, feeling invisible. The sorrow was a deep old ache. The outrage, though, was new. It was a cold, clean fire, and I was feeding it. I had to do all this while navigating the gauntlet of pre-Christmas social events. The forced cheer was almost unbearable. I attended the Chamber of Commerce holiday mixers, smiling and shaking hands, all while knowing my father was across the room, probably solidifying his lies about me. I volunteered for the children's charity wrapping party, my mother bustling about, praising everyone for their community spirit. I felt like a spy, smiling and passing the scissors while my mind catalogued every condescending "Oh, Diane" and every dismissive wave of her hand. The tension was making me sick, but every new slight was another entry in my journal, another log on the fire. The breaking point came at the annual mistletoe mingle at the country club, the crown jewel of my mother's social calendar. The air was thick with perfume and the sound of a string quartet playing carols. I was trying to avoid my family, keeping to the edges of the ballroom, when I saw Nathan holding court by the massive glittering Christmas tree. He was talking to the mayor, and to my horror, Mr. Henderson, the head of the community board. I slipped behind a large poinsettia display, my heart pounding. "The vision is really about a public-private partnership, Mayor," Nathan was saying, his voice smooth as bourbon. "The center is doing fine work, of course, but it's gotten static." "We were all so impressed with that youth grant," the mayor's wife chimed in. Nathan gave a self-deprecating laugh. "That was a team effort for sure. But honestly, I had to do a lot of heavy lifting on the back end. Diane? Well, she's passionate, but she gets bogged down in the weeds. I had to basically restructure the entire budget proposal just to make it viable for the board." Mr. Henderson nodded, looking thoughtful. "Your father mentioned you had some strong ideas for a new direction." It was a lie. A brazen, bald-faced, toxic lie. He wasn't just claiming credit. He was actively, publicly painting me as incompetent, as a passionate but foolish girl who needed her big brother to clean up her mess. I stood there, hidden by the festive red leaves, and the last of my confusion evaporated, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard certainty. The time for quiet investigation was over. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. This was about the truth. and I was going to make sure for the first time in my life that everyone heard it. My blood didn't just run cold, it felt like it had turned to slush. I stood behind the festive poinsettias, the lie Nathan just told that he'd saved my grant proposal echoing in the high-ceilinged ballroom. He was smiling, accepting nods of approval from the very people who held my career in their hands. The warmth of the room, the scent of pine and expensive perfume, the soft murmur of the string quartet, it all felt like a suffocating, tinsel-draped lie. The vulnerability I'd been nursing for weeks, the hurt, the confusion flared into a bright, hot rage. I wasn't going to let this stand. Not this time. I stepped out from behind the plant. Nathan. My voice was low, but it cut through his charming anecdote. The mayor, Mr. Henderson, and their wives all turned to look at me. Nathan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Diane," he said, forcing a jovial tone. "Come join us, I need to speak with you, now." I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and walked toward the glass doors leading to the club's deserted terrace. The click of my heels on the marble floor abnormally loud in the sudden quiet. I heard him make his excuses, his voice a smooth murmur of family matters, before his footsteps followed me out into the frigid night air. The cold hit me like a slap, but I was grateful for it. It cleared my head. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I hissed, spinning to face him. The colored Christmas lights strung along the railing illuminated his face, but they couldn't hide the defensive sneer. "Excuse me," he said, buttoning his suit jacket. "I'm networking." "You're lying," I shot back. "You just took credit for my grant. You stood in there and told them you had to restructure my work. My work, Nathan." He had the audacity to sigh, to look disappointed in me. "Diane, you're being emotional. It's a party. I was just smoothing things over. You get so bogged down, you don't see the big picture. I was helping you, making the family look good. Helping me by telling my boss I'm incompetent, by positioning yourself for the job you knew I was sabotaged for." He dropped the act. His face went cold, mirroring the weather. "You are so dramatic. You always have been. You're making a scene, Di. It's Christmas. You need to calm down." Calm down. My voice was shaking, but not with fear. It was pure adrenaline. "You and Mom and Dad, you're conspiring against me. You lied about my emotional fragility to the board. You are actively trying to destroy my career. Just tell me why." He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Because you can't handle it, Diane. You're not built for it. You never were. You're just a functionary. Dad sees it, Mom sees it, and I'm not going to let you screw up this town's future because of your ego." The rawness of the insult, the sheer naked contempt hit me harder than a physical blow. I had no words. He stared at me, his breath fogging in the air. "Now if you'll excuse me," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "I have important people to talk to. Try not to embarrass us again." He turned and walked back into the warmth and light of the ballroom, leaving me alone in the freezing dark. I stood there, shaking my vulnerability at its absolute peak. The betrayal was complete, and it was devastating. I leaned against the icy stone railing, the festive music from inside a muffled, mocking rhythm. I watched him through the glass. He rejoined the group, said something funny, and they all laughed. Then I saw it. My parents standing near the fireplace. They hadn't come out. They hadn't intervened. They were watching me standing alone on the terrace. My mother met my gaze. She didn't look concerned or sympathetic. Her look was cold, sharp, and assessing. It was a warning. And in that moment, the final terrible piece clicked into place. They were all in on it. This wasn't just Nathan's ambition or my parents' favoritism. This was a coordinated, deliberate campaign. My frustration, my hurt, my raw emotional state, it all coalesced and then hardened. It froze, solidifying into something new. A cold, quiet, unshakable resolve. I was done crying. I was done being confused. And I was done being loyal. They had made their choice. Now I was going to make mine. I realized I couldn't fight them on their terms. I couldn't win a battle of whispers and backroom lies. I had to use my own weapons, truth documentation, and the one thing they valued above all else, their public image. I wouldn't confront them in private again. I would do it on their stage. The plan began to form a tiny, sharp-edged crystal in my mind. The annual Patterson Christmas Eve open house. It was the centerpiece of their social year, the night where half the town, including the mayor, Mr. Henderson, and all their most important friends, gathered in our home to celebrate their perfect family. It would be my stage, too. I went home, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Nathan's words, "screw up this town's future," kept ringing in my ears. It was too much. This wasn't just about a job. It was about something bigger, something they were protecting. It was the old files my father mentioned at Thanksgiving. I went to the locked journal and the thumb drive I kept hidden in my closet. I had the emails. I had my notes. But I was missing the why. I spent all night fueled by a toxic mix of coffee and outrage, digging back into the community center's online server. I cross-referenced the revitalization project's donor list with the center's budgets from the last 5 years. And then I found it. It was buried in an addendum to a 2022 budget report. A large community partnership grant for $50,000, supposedly for an environmental impact study for the revitalization project. But the money hadn't gone to the town or to a known firm. It was paid out to a shell company I'd never heard of, RHP Consulting. My breath caught. RHP Robert, Helen, Patterson. I did a quick business registration search. The company was registered to a P.O. box with my father listed as the sole proprietor. They weren't just protecting Nathan, they were protecting themselves. They had been using the community center, my center, to siphon money. My reputation wasn't just collateral damage. I was the one person who, as director, would have had the authority and the skills to find this. I wasn't a threat to Nathan's ego. I was a threat to their entire fraudulent empire. The screen in my dark office glowed, illuminating 3 letters: RHP Robert, Helen, Patterson. The discovery of the shell company shifted something fundamental inside me. This wasn't just a petty family drama about favoritism or a desperate attempt to prop up my brother. This was calculated criminal fraud. My parents weren't just manipulative. They were thieves siphoning money from the very community they pretended to serve, using my community center as their personal bank. The old files my father feared weren't just embarrassing, they were evidence. And I wasn't just a threat to Nathan's ego. I was the one person with the access and the integrity who could expose them. The sorrow I'd been carrying for weeks curdled into a cold, hard disgust. The betrayal was so profound it left me breathless. My first impulse was to go to the police, to call the local paper and blow the whistle. But I stopped my hand hovering over the phone. I thought of the kids in the after-school program, the seniors who relied on our meal deliveries, the trust the town placed in the center itself. If I went public in a blaze of righteous anger, I wouldn't just destroy my family. I'd destroy the center. The funding would dry up. The programs would be suspended. The community, the innocent people I'd been working to protect, would be the ones who paid the price for my family's greed. This moral dilemma was a physical weight. I couldn't let them get away with it, but I couldn't burn down the whole village to catch the villains. My plan, the one I'd been forming for the Christmas Eve party, had to change. It couldn't be a vengeful act of exposure. It had to be a surgical strike aimed only at the guilty, protecting the innocent. My integrity demanded it. My determination crystallized. I had 1 week. I became a master of compartmentalization. By day, I was the smiling, competent Diane helping to hang wreaths at the center. By night, I was a forensic investigator. I didn't just print the RHP consulting invoices. I cross-referenced them with my father's travel schedule, proving he couldn't have been at the consulting meetings he'd billed for. I printed the email from my father painting me as emotionally fragile and placed it next to the performance review I'd received just a month earlier, signed by Mr. Henderson himself, calling me a model of stability and leadership. I was no longer just safeguarding my reputation. I was building an undeniable case. I also began my small acts of empowerment. I couldn't let their narrative be the only one. At the town's final budget hearing, when Nathan was invited to give preliminary thoughts, on the revitalization, I stood up during the public comment period. I didn't mention him. I simply presented a 5-minute data-driven overview of the community center's actual economic impact, using the exact metrics from the grant I had secured. I spoke clearly, firmly, and factually. I felt my father's eyes on me from the front row, but I never wavered. It was a subtle victory, but when I sat down, the room felt different. I had re-established my own authority. And then I found allies. They weren't soldiers, but they were witnesses. My Aunt Clara, my father's estranged sister, approached me after the budget meeting. She was a quiet woman I'd never known well. "That took guts, Diane," she said, squeezing my arm. "Your father's been a bully since he was 10. It's good to see someone finally standing up to him. Your grandfather would be proud of your integrity." Her words were a shield. A few days later, Margaret, my mentor, called me. "I've been making some quiet inquiries since we spoke," she said, her voice grim. "Henderson is stonewalling, but I have 2 other board members who are concerned. They find Nathan's sudden expertise suspicious. They're on your side, Diane. They just need proof." The support, small and scattered as it was, fortified me. I wasn't alone. My sorrow over my broken family was still a constant ache, but the determination to see this through, to choose integrity over loyalty, was stronger. The plan was now set, the target locked. The Christmas Eve open house. My mother was in a frenzy of preparation, the house gleaming with silver and red velvet. I had my evidence compiled in a series of plain manila envelopes. One for Mr. Henderson, one for the mayor, one for Aunt Clara, who I now knew would be a witness, and one for Margaret to deliver to the other board members. I wouldn't make a scene. I would let my father give his toast, and then I would quietly, personally deliver the truth. It was the night before the party, Christmas Eve. I was standing in the living room watching my father and Nathan laughing as they put the antique angel on top of the tree. My mother brought them hot chocolate, her face beaming with pride. They looked for all the world like the perfect American family. And I realized with a sudden, devastating clarity that this was the last time I would ever see them like this. My quiet surgical plan was still a bomb. When I handed over those envelopes, I would be detonating our entire family. There would be no going back. The relationships wouldn't just be strained, they would be obliterated. I was about to shatter everything. The Christmas Eve open house was the pinnacle of my mother's artistry. The house wasn't just decorated, it was curated. Hundreds of white candles flickered, casting a glow on silver garlands and bowls of pomegranates. A string quartet played softly in the foyer, and the air smelled of mulled wine, pine, and my mother's expensive perfume. The elite of our town were all there, the mayor, the entire community board, donors and neighbors, all mingling, laughing, holding crystal glasses. It was a perfect, glittering portrait of the Patterson family's success. I moved through the crowd, my heart a cold, steady drum. I felt strangely calm, detached, a surgeon preparing for a necessary, painful operation. My small clutch bag was heavy, not with cosmetics, but with 4 manila envelopes. My father, glass in hand, moved to stand by the magnificent 16-foot Fraser fir. He tapped a spoon against his glass, the clear chime cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice radiating warmth and authority. "Helen and I are so grateful to have you here. This time of year, it's about what truly matters. It's about family, about community, and about integrity." I had to stop myself from laughing. He continued, "It's about building a legacy, one we can be proud to pass on. And I've never been prouder of my family." He raised his glass to my mother, who beamed, and then to Nathan. "To Nathan for his brilliant vision for this town's future. We're all expecting great things." As the polite applause rippled, I knew this was my moment. The hypocrisy was a living thing, thick and suffocating. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I walked directly to Mr. Henderson, who was standing near the fireplace. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He turned, smiling. "Diane, Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," I said, handing him the first envelope. I believe you were given some misinformation about my emotional fragility. I thought you should see my last performance review. I've also included some financial documents from the center that I think the board needs to review immediately." His smile faltered. He looked from me to the envelope. "Financials. It concerns a vendor called RHP Consulting," I said just loud enough for him to hear. He paled. My father, his performance complete, was walking toward us, his arm extended to clap Henderson on the back. "Robert?" Henderson said, his voice suddenly sharp, holding up the envelope. "What is RHP Consulting?" My father's smile froze. It didn't vanish, but it hardened like a mask of ice. "Diane," he said, his voice a low warning. "This is neither the time nor the place." "This is the only place," I said, and my voice was stronger now. "You made it the place when you used your influence to lie about me." "Lie?" my mother said, gliding over her face, a mask of perfect hostess concern. "Diane, dear, what are you talking about? You seem upset." "I am not upset, Mom. I'm precise." I turned back to my father. "You called me fragile. You said I couldn't handle the stress." I saw Nathan hovering, his expression turning sour. "And you," I said, turning to him, "you told the mayor I was bogged down in the weeds. You claimed my grant as your own." The string quartet had thankfully started a new, louder piece, but a bubble of silence had formed around us. "Diane, you're hysterical." Nathan snapped, his charm vanishing, revealing the ugly spite beneath. "See," he said to Henderson, "this is what I was talking about." "No," I said, and this time my voice did rise, cutting through the noise. "This is what I'm talking about." I pulled the second envelope from my bag and handed it to the mayor. "Mayor, this is a copy of my father's email to the board alongside my performance review. It also includes the invoices my father, as RHP Consulting, billed to the community center for work that was never performed." "What?" The mayor said it. My mother gasped, a theatrical, wounded sound. "How dare you!" she hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. "After everything we've given you, you ungrateful! What have you given me?" I shot back, the dam of my restraint finally breaking. The outrage, the heartbreak, the decades of being diminished, it all poured out, not as hysteria, but as a cold, righteous fire. "A supporting role in Nathan's life. Have you given me the truth? You stole from this community? You sabotaged your own daughter to protect your fraud." The word hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Fraud. The music stopped. My father's face was white. He was staring at Henderson, who was pulling the documents from the envelope. He was trapped. "You've ruined us," my mother whispered, her mask crumbling, revealing the terror beneath. "No," I said, looking at the three of them, my father silent and exposed, my mother trembling with rage and shame, my brother staring at me with pure, undiluted hatred. "You ruined yourselves. I'm just the one who turned on the lights." I felt a profound cleansing wave of catharsis. I had refused to be silenced. I had taken back my own story. I looked past them to Aunt Clara, who I had already given an envelope to. She was watching, her face grim, but she nodded at me, a single sharp affirmation. My autonomy was mine again. "Get out," my father finally said, his voice a gravelly ruin. "Get out of this house." "Gladly," I said. I set my last envelope, the one with everything for Margaret and the rest of the board, on the table. I turned my back on them. I walked through the silent, stunned crowd, past the glittering tree, past the wreckage of my family. I didn't run. I walked. I had set my boundaries, and they were 1,000 miles away from this house. As I pulled open the heavy front door, the cold night air felt like a baptism. I was free. But as the door clicked shut behind me, the finality of it hit me. I had won. I had lost. I was standing alone on the snowy steps, and I had no idea what came next, if I would ever speak to them again, or if reconciliation, even on my own terms, was even possible. I stood on the snowy sidewalk for a full minute, the sound of the heavy oak door clicking shut echoing in the sudden, profound silence. The cold air stung my cheeks, which were hot, not with tears, but with a draining electric adrenaline. Behind me, the muffled sound of the string quartet faltered and then stopped completely. I was outside. I was alone. It was Christmas Eve, and I had just set a match to my entire life. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb, and made the only call I could. Margaret. My voice was a shaky whisper. It's done. She didn't ask what was done. She didn't ask for details. Where are you? She asked, her voice a low, steady rumble. On my way. 10 minutes later, her old Subaru pulled up. I got in. I didn't cry. I just watched the festive lights of my town blur past the window, each one a glittering alien star in a world that no longer felt like mine. The next morning, Christmas Day, was the quietest I have ever known. I woke up in Margaret's spare room, the one with the floral wallpaper to the smell of coffee. My phone charging on the nightstand was a silent black rectangle. No frantic calls. No angry texts from my mother. No vitriolic misspelled rants from Nathan or my father. The silence was its own message, more final than any explosion. The break was clean, total, and terrifying. In a town this small, news travels faster than a winter wind. By the day after Christmas, Margaret, through her own network, confirmed the fallout had begun. The community board had convened an emergency closed-door meeting on Christmas Day. Mr. Henderson had tendered his immediate resignation, citing personal health reasons. The mayor's office had issued a terse one-sentence statement wishing everyone a peaceful holiday season and refusing all further comment. My phone did ring 2 days later, an unlisted number. I hesitated, then answered. Diane. The voice was dry, unfamiliar. It's your Aunt Clara, my father's estranged sister, the one who had given me that silent nod. I just wanted you to know, she said, her voice crackling slightly. I always saw you. Your grandfather, my father, he used to say, you can't build a strong house on a rotten foundation. Your father, he and Helen forgot that. Thank you, I whispered, clutching the phone. It's a mess, child, she said, and I heard her take a drag from a cigarette. A god-awful public mess, but it's a clean mess for a change. Don't you dare let them make you feel guilty for telling the truth. The call ended. A strained relationship, yes, but perhaps the only honest one I had left in that family. I spent the week between Christmas and New Year's in a strange, suspended limbo. Margaret gave me space, and for that I was eternally grateful. I took long walks in the snow-covered woods behind her house, the only sound the crunch of my boots and my own breathing. The grief came in waves, sharp and sudden. I was mourning. Not for the family I'd just lost, but for the one I'd never had, the one I'd spent 29 years trying to earn. I mourned the idea of a mother who would protect me, of a father who would be proud of me, of a brother who would be a friend. I had to finally painfully accept that they didn't exist. But as I walked, I also felt something else, a deep, quiet strength. It was the solid ground of moral clarity. I had chosen integrity. I had refused to be the scapegoat. I had refused to let them harm the community center, my real home. My personal growth was a tender new thing, like a winter plant pushing up through the ice. I began to look at listings for small apartments. I went back to the center, my head held high, bracing for the whispers. But the whispers weren't what I expected. Sarah from accounting, who I'd never spoken to about anything other than budgets, quietly left a container of homemade lasagna on my desk. Mike, the youth coordinator, just gave me a long, steady look and said, "Good to have you back, Di. We've got your back." This was my support network. This was my solidarity. It wasn't built on a shared name or a blood obligation. It was built on shared work, on mutual respect. It was real. I started to envision a future, my future one, that wasn't defined by their scripts. It was New Year's Eve. I was at Margaret's boxing up the few things I'd need for the new one-bedroom apartment I'd just secured. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Patterson," a formal female voice asked. This is Elaine Bishop, the new acting chair of the community board. My stomach tightened. Yes, hello. The board has concluded its internal investigation, she said, her voice all business. The discrepancies have been handled. The individuals involved will be making full financial restitution, and the board has accepted this to avoid a public scandal that would harm the center's mission. A clean mess, just as Aunt Clara said. Ms. Patterson, we find ourselves in need of leadership. Someone with unimpeachable integrity, who knows the center's operations and who has the proven trust of the community. The board has voted unanimously. We would like to offer you the position of interim director effective immediately. I sank down onto the edge of the spare bed, the cardboard box in my lap. It wasn't just a job. It was a validation. It was a fresh start, not by running away, but by stepping up to rebuild. January in the Midwest is a lesson in endurance. The world is stripped down to shades of white and gray, and the air is so cold it feels like a physical barrier. But from my new office, the one with the director's nameplate on the door, it just looks clean. I took the job. I said yes. For the first few days, I would walk into the room and expect to feel like an imposter, like I was just a girl playing dress-up in a seat of authority. But the feeling never came. In its place, there's just a quiet, solid sense of rightness. This, I realize, is what empowerment feels like. It's not a lightning strike. It's not the loud, brittle confidence my father projected. It's a deep foundational strength built from the rubble of what I'd survived. My vulnerability, the emotional fragility my father had tried to weaponize against me, hadn't been a weakness after all. It had been my compass. It was the part of me that knew long before my brain would admit it that something was deeply wrong. It was the part that felt the sting of injustice, and it was the part that finally mercifully had the courage to fight back. I've had to build a new dictionary for myself. I've had to redefine the words that my family hollowed out. Loyalty. For 29 years, loyalty meant silence. It meant accepting my assigned role, swallowing my own achievements so my brothers could shine brighter, and never ever questioning the family's perfect public-facing script. That I now see wasn't loyalty, it was a cage. My new loyalty is to the truth. It's to the kids in our after-school program, to the integrity of the center I now lead, and most terrifyingly to myself. I've learned that self-respect isn't a selfish indulgence. It's a non-negotiable requirement for a healthy life. And personal freedom isn't about rebellion. It's about having the right to build a life on your own terms, based on your own values. These concepts no longer feel like they're in conflict. They coexist finally peacefully inside me. The triumph is real, but it is tempered by a loss that is just as profound. I walk through my new small apartment, and the silence is a companion. I am free, but I am also, in a very real sense, an orphan. I haven't heard from them. Not a single phone call, not one text of rage. The only communication I received was a single sterile letter from an attorney I don't know informing me that my parents had expedited their retirement and relocated to Florida. They had sold the house I grew up in, the house where I'd stood by the Christmas tree, and detonated my life to an out-of-state holding company. It was all gone. There was no final tearful confrontation. No chance for an apology, however hollow. They didn't just leave. They erased themselves. They erased me. And the catharsis in that is a strange and painful one. It's the final, undeniable proof that their love was always conditional, and the condition was my silence. My victory wasn't in beating them. It was simply in surviving them, in choosing to save myself when they made it clear they would let me drown. Tonight, I'm the last one to leave the center. I lock the front doors, the jingle of the keys in the cavernous quiet hall, a sound that feels like mine. I step outside, zipping my coat against the cold. It's snowing. Not the frantic, wind-driven snow of a blizzard, but the big, soft, quiet flakes that seem to absorb all the sound in the world. I stand on the steps, not as a victim, not as a vengeful daughter, but just as me. Diane Patterson, Director of the Community Center. I look up, letting the flakes melt on my face. I've learned that betrayal is a trauma, but the antidote is truth. I've learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back to the person you were before. It's about allowing the breaks to heal you into someone stronger, someone more defined. And forgiveness. Forgiveness is a complicated word. I don't know if I can ever forgive them for what they did. But I have finally forgiven myself for not seeing it sooner, for not being strong enough for long enough. I breathe in the cold, clean air. There is no triumph without loss. There is no catharsis without pain. But for the first time in my life, I am not looking over my shoulder. I am not waiting for a critique or bracing for a subtle slight. My future isn't a pre-written script. It's a blank page and the pen is in my hand. I pull my scarf tighter and I walk down the shoveled sidewalk, my boots crunching in the fresh snow heading home. And with that, Diane closes a painful chapter, finally breathing in the clean air of her new life. What did you think of her final choice to reclaim her story? We truly read every single one of your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy stories of strength and resilience, be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.